Hi teachers, I'm Mark Richard, Educational Services Manager for Oxford University Press. In this video, my question is, how can we help students to convert the language input they receive into language output? Well, think about that. When we talk about input, what kinds of English language input does anyone receive, including your students? And the same about output. Now, I'm not just talking about reading and listening and then speaking and writing. There are three kinds of language input which anyone receives, whether they're learning a language or growing up in their home environment. The first is extensive, hearing language around us all the time in a kind of cloud, and our unconscious language acquisition processes work on that. Another kind is intensive language input. It could be songs, nursery rhymes, or if my mother when I was little said, "Mark, it's time to get up, it's time to have breakfast, it's time to brush your teeth, it's time to get dressed, it's time to go to school." That's a really intensive example of language input, and soon not only could I understand that, but I could say the same pattern back. Another kind is analyzed, when students or children are conscious that they're learning language, and often it happens with native speakers when a child says something and they make a mistake. "Oh, I eated the whole lot," and their mother says, "Oh, you ate the whole lot." And so they're consciously learning language there. These three types of language input convert through to language output. So extensive language output, free speech and writing. Intensive language output is when, well, for example, reciting a song or a nursery rhyme. So something that you've really focused on and you've remembered it and you're going to say it in the output or write it. And analyzed, when students or language learners of any kind, they practice patterns of language which the teachers explain to them, which they've analyzed. And hopefully they practice it so much it becomes automatic and they are fluent. So let's think about these three kinds of language input and output. According to Michael Swan, while all three of them are important, the proportions in a given teaching program will vary according to the learner's needs and the availability of each element, both in and out of class. If you think about a native speaker of any language, they've got so much input from the cloud, that extensive input, that's really helpful. And what Michael Swan says is that, well, language learners don't have as much extensive input and they don't have the chance to extensively output. So probably in a language learning scenario, you need to focus more on the other two, which is intensive input and output and analyzed input and output. But the important thing is that language learners get less exposure to language. So the examples that you've got to input into them, they have to have a really high impact. Now, let's think about short reading texts. It's too short to be extensive input. It's too long to analyze everything in it. By the way, that's one of the worst things you can do with a text like this, is when the teacher spends the whole lesson just kind of guiding the students through every sentence and explaining the grammar. Very boring. What I do with a text like this is intensive input-output work. So it's a short sample of selected language. It's got a lot of repetition of the same grammar in it. Students will really work hard in it and it will serve as a basis for controlled, intensive production. I much prefer this to doing comprehension questions. So how does this work? So first you have the intensive input. Students are going to work really hard on this text. They'll engage deeply with it. They're going to work so hard on it that some of the language is going to stick in their heads and they'll internalize vocab, collocations, expressions that they see and hear. So let's look at this text as an example. I'll do a quick lead-in. Whoa, look at these photos. So we're going to read about this topic. Who are these people? Where are they and what are they doing? What do you think is the topic of this text? Is this okay? Do you think the top photo, is that okay what she's doing? What about the bottom photo? How about these two photos? is the first one in a gallery. Is that fine, do you think? What about the second one? Can you guess what the title is? When selfies are a good or bad? Bad idea. Okay, so here we have this text, and how can we do some intensive language input with this? There are many ways. I'm going to quickly show you one way. I'm just going to use the top of this article for my example. So what I like to do is ask students to take a sheet of paper and they write down some key words from the passage, and then I play the CD track or read to them. And I'll just read you the beginning here. Think about these situations. You're standing in front of a world-famous tourist attraction. You're walking around a zoo and looking at all the animals. You're visiting one of the tallest buildings in the world. You're looking at a famous painting in an art gallery. In every situation, you want to take a selfie. Selfies are fun, so what's the problem? So students listen to that, and then they begin to use their notes as a kind of map. What words did they hear before and after those key words? Oh, they note down, in front of a world-famous something. Something about a zoo and looking. Buildings? Oh, I heard tallest buildings. And so students do this by themselves, then they can get together in pairs and share words they caught with each other. Then I will let them listen to the passage again, and they will keep adding more and more words. And what they're doing is they're building phrases. And when you build phrases, you get word power, right? You can turn what you get in the input, you can start to turn it into output, right? Collocations, phrases, that kind of thing. And so what's happening is that students are engaging deeply with a short text. It's difficult. They cannot write down every word they hear because it's too hard, right? But they have to work really hard, and some of that language is going to stick because their brains are very active. And they begin to internalize the language they hear, whether it's grammar patterns or collocations or words. And now we can start to collect that language through hearing, and sometimes I'll let students read the article too. So that's the input, and the key is students are working hard with the key language. Next, we can start to turn this into output. So when students produce the language in output, what they're doing is practicing using what they've heard and read in the input in a controlled but creative manner. So they're reusing the language from the text, often to express their own ideas. And what this does is fixes the language in students' heads, and later they'll be able to come back to it, to recall it, to use it. All right, now the easiest way to begin this is for students to just use those word maps they've got, get into pairs, and just from using their word maps and their memory, use the words they've noted down to retell what happened in the article to a partner. So that's great. They're using a combination of their own words together with language they've picked up. That's not very creative, but they're using the language in output. And if you want to, you can get a bit more creative. So you see here in the article, there's a sentence pattern. I can tell you the grammar in this unit is present continuous. You won't be surprised to know that. You can see a lot of the present continuous there. So students can take this language as a kind of template in the input, do something to note it down, and then they can get creative and make their own little conversations or sketches, which they can write, they can then perform. And they're reusing the language, but putting their own twist in it. Excuse me, you're standing in front of a world-famous tourist attraction, which happened to me at the Taj Mahal in India, by the way. All right, someone taking a picture in front of me, very annoying. And that person said, I want to take a selfie, what's the problem? And students in pairs can maybe write a conversation, so they're reusing that language from the input, but being a bit creative with it. Well, here's another example. Hey! Do you know that you're standing in the middle of the busiest coffee shop in London? We want to take a selfie. What's the problem? And you can imagine students continuing that conversation, performing it, having a little bit of fun with the language. So in the output, we've seen that students are reusing what they've noted down from the input, and in a controlled but often quite creative manner, producing language of their own. Okay, they're using what they've learned. The language is fixing somewhere in their brains, and they'll be able to use those patterns, those collocations, those words in the future. So that for me is a very quick example of this intensive input-output approach to using texts. And honestly, I think students get a lot more out of that in terms of both the input and the output than, for example, answering comprehension questions. You know, whenever I get a short reading text, this is how I think of a lesson. First, my job is to get the students interested in the topic. And I do that by building their curiosity, usually through making predictions. Then I think about how to input the language into their brains, usually through listening and various reading tasks. Next comes the output. Now, in real life, it can take years for someone to get language input and convert that into output. And we try, but it's very, very difficult, and sometimes it doesn't work. So the key is this. Teachers need to think of some intermediary stage where students take the language input and they have to do something with it. It's an activity, noting down the language in some way, drawing a picture to represent what's happening in the input. And that can serve as a kind of base from which they can then produce the output. So there's usually an activity between input and output, and that helps turn the cog and make the output work smoother. And that's how I think of these lessons, and that's how I think of the intensive input-output approach. So what other activities can you think of which would work with this intensive input-output approach? And what materials would you need to make these activities work? If you would like to find out more about the intensive input-output method, take a look at this article. All of the ideas come from this Michael Swan piece. So look at that. And if you'd like to find out more about Smart Choice 4th edition and the research that's gone into motivating students, please get the brochure, and that will include a link to the impact study.